right, well, welcome everybody. My name is Leah Burton, and I want to welcome you to the third of 4 weekly sessions making up our Spring Training 2021 virtual edition. Today, our topic is Building Inclusive Communities of Innovation, Essential DEI Strategies. If you've attended the last few AURP conferences, you've had the opportunity to engage in great programming on the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is a priority for the board, and I know from conversations with many of you that it's a priority with our membership. And what I hear from you loud and clear is a desire for guidance in terms of metrics, best practices, and opportunities to measure progress toward equitable communities of innovation. So today, you'll hear from some experts in equity-focused work. I've enjoyed getting to know each of these individuals, so let me introduce them to you now. Our opening speaker today is Andrea Batista Schlesinger, Managing Partner of the Los Angeles Office for HR&A. Andrea leads the Inclusive Cities practice for the firm. You'll hear from Danya Perry, Director of Equitable Economic Development and DEI with Wake County Economic Development. Danya also leads the Raleigh Chamber's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusivity Alliance, among other efforts. Rebecca Motley, Incubator Manager for the University of Illinois Research Park, and Lori Gold Patterson, Chief Executive Officer and Corporate Diversity and Inclusion Advisor for Pixo-Vin, will walk us through their successful Reboot program. And finally, Ray Trapp, Vice President of Strategic Engagement for Research Triangle Park, will make the case for change toward a more equitable RTP through the work with their Owners and Tenants Association. We have 3 goals and deliverables for today's session. We will develop frameworks, or we'll discuss rather frameworks for delivering resources that move the needle toward equitable opportunities. We'll talk about programming to create high impact DEI strategies, and also we'll get into measurable outcomes for benchmarking progress. Just a bit about how we will organize today's session. We have 2 opportunities for Q&A today. After Andrea's presentation, we will pause for Q&A with her. Then we'll hear 3 case studies from our panelists, and we'll entertain questions after those presentations. And finally, we'll go into breakout groups for discussion around the following questions. What challenge to diversity, equity, or inclusion are you struggling with right now? Why is it a challenge? What is your desired outcome, and where are you stuck? And we'll wrap up our whole session today with a report out from the breakout sessions. So before I turn it over to Andrea, I want to share a personal story. Early on in my career with Centennial Campus, Bob Giolis encouraged me to think about how we could pull some of the local nonprofit organizations into our plans for Centennial Campus. I'm talking about neighborhood organizations doing work around job training and affordable housing, access to technology, really important work going on in our community. And we had a series of meetings over many months with these organizations, and we struggled to develop any partnerships of impact and longevity. And when I think back about that work, I view it as a missed opportunity at the very best. And honestly, it was a failure. But we marched on, and Centennial Campus continued to flourish. And this is what I want to impress upon you today. If we don't make equity a priority in our communities of innovation with goals and measurable outcomes, it won't affect each of us in the same way that high vacancy does today. The effect of doing nothing is the status quo. Let me repeat that. The effect of doing nothing is the status quo. And that could be enough, but I think from talking with so many of you, we are called to something bigger than the status quo. And that's what we want to discuss today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Andrea as our opening speaker. Take it over, Andrea.
All right, great. Gosh, do I have to look at that headshot, Leah? Okay, phew. I was so young and pretty then. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity, and I've so enjoyed talking with Leah and the other panelists on this, and all the thought and care that you all have put into this. So let me see if I can try to do it some justice. So, we're gathered here together to talk about, quote, building inclusive communities of innovation, essential DEI strategies. And I was prepping my notes. I thought, my God, that's a mouthful. So many terms, so much space in which to render those terms meaningless, such that they even lose their status. They've become acronyms. They've become abbreviations. DEI, what does inclusive really mean? What does it mean for it to be essential? Diversity versus equity, equity versus equality, inclusive versus, and then of course the elusive word, but my favorite, strategies. It's such an unfortunate trend in our language that as words gain prominence, we fight for them to have prominence. Because they're so important, at the same time, we risk that they lose meaning, that they lose specificity in their ubiquity. Sometimes we never really actually knew the meaning at all. The terms just signified things, so for some of you, equity may be interchangeable with diversity and inclusion, part of doing the right thing, engaging with your neighbors, doing the kind of outreach that Leah was talking about. And I was moved by, her motivation to have this conversation, creating opportunities for people to cross the invisible barrier into your world, making sure you're not all white, holding community programs. That could be what those terms signify to you. And I'll admit something here. I'm assuming, we're safe space. Sometimes for me, the word innovation has lost its meaning and its specificity. It feels sometimes like a stand-in for something that means that the person who has claimed that term has made something that's better, different, worth investing in. I'll tell you a secret, and I don't want to give any clues because you can read my bio, but I worked for someone in a prominent role who I realized that if I put the word innovation on a slide, he would automatically approve the idea. Not even kidding. So I learned to deploy the word wisely, but as you challenged me to try to get more serious about the word equity today, I also realized that I need to get more serious about, the word innovation, and hopefully these terms won't be pitted against one another, innovation and inclusion, in the way that the world that I come from, these traditional approaches to economic development and policy and planning, that has always meant expansion by exclusion. It's always meant, that there were winners and losers. And so, I've enjoyed trying to challenge myself in this and hope, and this is really my first point of 3 for you today, is that you seize the opportunity to claim the meaning of these words. Unpack it. Don't say DEI anymore. Unpack them. They have definitions beyond what they evoke. And our understanding and then embrace of the specificity of these words is what will enable us to work toward them. Okay, so my work focuses on equity, I'll be honest. To me, I define equity in a very specific way. I paraphrase from the Government Alliance on Racial Equity. And I'm going to try this out and see if it resonates with you in this talk and in this workshop. An equitable city is one in which who you are, your identity, does not determine how you fare. It doesn't determine how you benefit from that place, from that project, from that policy. It doesn't determine how you will fare. In many of the cities, most of the cities in this country, with an urban planning and policy built on the foundations of systemic racism, who you are determines everything. It determines where you live. It determines how you live. It determines whether you live, for how long you live, the air that you breathe while you are living. So the question, the challenge that I take in my work is, how do we make it so that identity is no longer predictive? So I take this definition in my work on transformative projects, like the building of a new park. I'm going to get into this in some more detail later as we talk about frameworks. So I ask my clients and my collaborators, in what you're building here, does a person's identity determine how they will fare when they enter this park? Will it determine how they can access the park based on where you have strategically put the entrances? Will it change how the person feels in the park because of how the park is secured? How the common spaces are designed to work for my body and ability? The language of the signage will help me determine whether I feel welcome in the park. I think about this in my work on systems. Does who I am determine, for example, how I fare in the criminal legal system? Obviously a provocative question this very week. Spent a lot of time working in the city of Philadelphia to try and re-envision the physical spaces in which the city offers services to people who are re-entering from jail or prison. In the United States, the national average, maybe take a second to think about how many Americans do you think are on probation or parole? The answer is about 1 in 50. In Philly, it's 1 in 14 Black Philadelphians are under the supervision of probation and parole. You feel that who you are determines how you fare in every element, in the pores of this system. And I think about it when I watch people walk into this building downtown to meet with their probation and parole officer. It's clear who you are and how you are valued. And our work there was to try to create community-based centers in which people would access services and opportunities. I think about this in my work on cities overall. How does who you are determine how you fare? My work is based on the goal, elusive, of interrupting the systems that guarantee this predictability by challenging traditional forms of economic development and policymaking that enshrine inequity. And I ask you to think about the ways in traditional forms of creating communities of innovation also play a role either in furthering inequities or in rendering identity less predictive. I've learned that there's no perfect toolbox. And I produce a lot of toolboxes. I produce a lot of that work, but there is no perfect toolbox to overcome a lack of willingness to name the ways that systemic racism intersects power and finds expression in our approaches to the work that we do, from economic development to policy to planning to engagement. There is no perfect MWBE program to compensate for the ways that our approaches glorify shiny new things, even if they do harm to surrounding communities by making it impossible for people who have lived near this new shiny thing to continue to afford to be able to do so. There's no accidental equity in this world. There's no equivalence to it. So if we, and as Leah said about the status quo, either we work towards rendering identity no longer predictive of how someone feels or fares in a space, or we don't. All right, so generally I'm the buzzkill. And in this case, then, our other speakers who I've enjoyed getting to know, the Ray and Onion, they're gonna come in and give you lots of happy stories. So I drew the short straw in giving this opening, but so as not to be a buzzkill, moving to my second point of 3 that I want to make in this time, which is that the practice of embedding equity into our work is more about the questions that we ask than any prepackaged answers. I often ask, my clients who assume that, there's always winners. Who could this policy perhaps, or program or initiative, who could lose? For whom is this policy? Who is this intended to regulate? What am I assuming about the people who will benefit? Who participated in the making of this policy, program, or approach? I mean, thinking now about Leah's story of, at what point were those communities engaged? And by the time Leah was reaching them, did they feel that it was too late? Does the implementation of this policy, program, approach, vision assume a lack of bias on the part of those implementing it? That's a big one for me. I've seen many great plans and ideas and policies die on the vine because we haven't done the work to root out the bias on the part of the frontline folks implementing it, or certainly the central folks dictating it. Other questions can be challenging. Who do you consider to be innovative? I often ask people in my business, in this urban policy world, to close their eyes and to picture, their dream city, vital, dynamic, and then to unpack, what are their assumptions? What are the assumptions in that vision? Who do they see? What are those people doing? So much of the work that we do has to do with these visions, what we see when we close our eyes. What's bustling? What's blight? Where are people congregating in a way that looks beautiful to some, threatening to others? I'm oversimplifying. Of course I am. But when you close your eyes, what do you see as a community of innovation? And how can we unpack what that means for how you approach issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Who's in your community versus who's served by it? These are examples of the kinds of questions that, if engaged with, can lead us in interesting directions. In fact, I argue that if these questions become part of our habits of mind, I believe strongly that just by the nature of this exercise, we will create more equitable policies, practices, and approaches. Okay, my final argument is that equity is as much about what happens in the spaces that we build, in what happens in those areas of our concern, as it is what happens around. So now back to the questions. When I work on projects, I ask 3 questions. How can we make this project equitable, this thing that we're doing, this thing we're building? How can we mitigate against might further inequity? I might have frozen there for a second, so I'm going to start. How can I make this project equitable? How can I mitigate against any ways in which this project might further inequity? Accidentally, unintentionally, but we have to ask the question. And the third, and this is the key one that I want to focus on, how can this project make a more equitable city? It's this last question that tests us. It's the last question that asks us to think about our projects. We think about them in closed ways as laboratories, but then to turn that inside out and to think about our communities, about our projects, about our places as actors, as assets, as leverage. And then we become oriented less about how we can fix the things and make perfect what's happening within these borders, but rather, how is what we are building here going to make a more equitable city and tackle the inequities beyond our borders? As I look back at the history of this, and I spend some time doing that, having some useless advanced degrees in history, for which I'm still paying ample student loans. I trace, the desire first, to do planning and policy in the name of communities, then to this kind of community benefit orientation, where we said we're going to do the things that we're doing, but we're going to trade. And communities said, you can do the things that you're doing, but we're going to play. We have power here. We're going to leverage our power to extract benefits from projects, local hire for jobs, affordable housing as part of whatever is to be built. It all sounded good, and it is. But I think we're in the next iteration. We're in the next moment in which we realize that those responses have actually not dislodged inequity, racial inequity in our places, in our cities, and in our country, and it has left us vulnerable. It's left us vulnerable and lacking in resilience. And so now we need to move from not caring at all or doing in the name of, this is a good idea in the name of, to how do we extract benefit, to how do we view each and every project that we initiate as a lever with the goal and North Star of moving towards more equitable places. So if we care about cities, we care about equity inclusion, we care about whether our projects further gentrification or displacement. And I want to separate those two things. And I don't know, and I look forward to hearing from you whether they are concerns in the places where you work. But I understand the question is, can people afford to live around new parks and developments in cities? But for others, it's less about whether they can afford to live there, but more about the trauma of feeling that a place is no longer their own. And I call that gentrification. That gentrification is a trauma. So we're past the time when we can justify insularity or think about good ideas that have benefits that can be distributed, like at Christmas. We're past that time. So sometimes this orientation and my little 3-question thing that works for me, maybe works for you, we'll see. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. As an example, I see these comments and I want to click on them but I'm going to exercise restraint because I know they're going to be great questions. So I worked for a while on one of the projects I'm most proud of with the visionary leadership of the Dallas Trinity Park Conservancy. Basically, it's a class. They're going to invest $200 million of private money in building this park, a new park to try to reclaim this river that was previously really a dividing line between communities. And normally or previously, that would be enough. It would be enough to say, we're going to take something that's empty and we're going to build something that's good. It's a park. It's good. It's inherently good. But, they said, we could easily catalyze the reimagining of a river, and you can almost picture, the images on a website and how pretty it would look. But they said, we want to do more because we're afraid that the very action that we would take here could perhaps further the inequity that exists around this park once all of the investment and the visitors and all of the impact that happens when you do transformative investments could have on the very communities that we want to engage. So we said we're going to ask these 3 questions. How are you going to build this park equitably in every way? How can this project contribute to making a more equitable Dallas? And how can we mitigate against any unforeseen consequences that might exacerbate the very disparities that they want to tackle? They let us ask those questions and they told us to go and come back to them and give them answers, because the value that would be created through this park just wasn't enough. The question was, what else would happen? Here's an example. For a park equity plan, you would normally think about, well, if we want to look at how to make a more equitable Dallas, then we got to think about what's one of the major ways in which inequity plays out. Well, the racial wealth gap in Dallas is stark, truly stark. So then we asked ourselves, how can this park lessen the racial wealth gap in Dallas? It changed the questions that we were asking from how can we make sure that people feel welcome in a park to how can we make sure that the people who own businesses or homes around it, how can they benefit, not just stay, how can they benefit from the wealth that would be generated from this park, to enjoy it, to benefit from it, to own it, not just to passively be welcome in the park, to have community-facing programs, but for this park to mean something that life in Dallas hasn't meant for Black residents, which is an opportunity to build wealth. So, I give that tiny example because the toolkit, and I'm happy to share with all of you that we came up with. See, I said I do toolkits, even though I don't think the answer is a toolkit. But we asked a whole other set of questions and found a whole other set of tools that tested our client. They had to not just be builders, they had to become policy advocates. They had to not just, care about the design of a park, they had to care about the design of a neighborhood. And it tested them. In this case, they rose, to the challenge. But I don't want to just come here and give you happy stories about when we had an amazing client who let us ask our 3 questions and everything was great. And they even paid on time and it was wonderful. It doesn't always work that way. So, we were engaged, for example, recently by clients who were working in collaboration with other institutions who wanted to take the largest undeveloped piece of land in a city and turn it really into a community of innovation. This piece of land was directly adjacent to a historically Black community, one of the few left in this city. And they reached out and said, we're terrified, since we have a long commitment, to the city, that our desire to build this community of innovation is going to mean harm for the community around it, and that this will be our legacy. And so they asked us to get to work. We asked the same 3 questions. In order, to begin, we started with, well, what has to be done? What has to be done with this land so that this community itself is built equitably? What would we have to do around it in order to ensure that we weren't furthering disparities? And by the way, quite frankly, we were already too late, as even the prospect of the accumulation of these parcels of land had already driven up rents and had already, the flow of displacement had already begun. So it was too late. And we talked about what the early actions had already contributed to and the radical actions that we thought, would need to happen in order for them to exist as a community of equity and innovation. And it was overwhelming. It was overwhelming. We basically said, look, honestly, all of the charitable investments that you've done in the community, everything, you probably would have had better results if you had just turned that into cash money and given it to the residents around this neighborhood, who would more likely be able to stay and to live there. And frankly, a lot of this intersects with power. We suggested that they create a monitoring shop, an independent monitoring shop that would over time measure how they were doing on their goals of an equitable project and how it was impacting the neighborhood. And we said, you should make this an independent watchdog that will keep track, and there'll be real metrics and not a community benefits agreement, which I know, many of you are familiar with, which is kind of a one and done, but rather an ongoing effort to hold you accountable. And, the response was no. We have good intentions here, and we may not get it right. We have good intentions. And so, so we didn't win. These were good people, but the mind shift to go from the community of innovation on empty land is good enough as it is to making it a mission to make a more equitable neighborhood and city, and frankly, to relinquishing power, not just inviting people to come to their table, but asking who will set this table and who will have the power to monitor that. It was too much. It was a bridge too far. So, lest you think that clients always listen to me, it doesn't always work. So I know many of you want tools, you want frameworks. I offered you one framework. I know you want tools, the perfect procurement policy, the perfect increment financing mechanism. But I'd argue, and this is what I'm trying to talk about today, and I know I'm at time, apologize, that the most important tools that you can deploy in this work are to be rigorous in your definitions. What do you mean by diversity? What do you mean by inclusion? What do you mean by equity? To approach this work with equity as a North Star that extends beyond your projects, but to the places in which you're located. And then to think about, as you answer those questions, how far are you willing to go? What power are you willing to share? And what roles are you willing to play? To this theme of questions, today's workshop, which we'll come to after we hear from our incredible case studies, where folks and visionary leaders have put this into practice, we're going to ask you to focus on questions and not jump to solutions. What are you struggling with? Don't just say DEI. Tell me what and define it. Why are you struggling? What are you after, and where are you getting stuck? And from there, it's got to be my firm belief, otherwise I'm in the wrong business, that from asking those questions, the tools will emerge. Thank you for the opportunity. Back to you, Leah. Thank you all.
Thanks, Andrea. I've written a lot of notes here, but what I want to do before I get into some of those takeaways, I want to address a couple of questions that have come through, and they may lead us to some more discussion as well. Laura from University of Illinois Research Park has a question here. We had an interesting debate in a university leadership meeting this morning related to this as we consider promotion and tenure policies. Ooh, that man. Hats off, Laura, for even being in that meeting. Okay, is doing public good at odds or part of economic development? If we're creating a greater tax base for our community and state, we will have more government funds for investment in social services, schools, all of those things. The opportunity cost of not creating incremental economic growth, of course, then proceeds. What do you think about that, Andrea?
Yeah, I mean, oh yeah, that question is the central tension of my work. And look, all I can say is the evidence is there. Our cities, our places are not more equitable than they were. Traditional downtown growth strategies, for example, revitalize that downtown, create that revenue, have not dislodged deeply racialized poverty and inequity in communities around those downtowns. The skyscrapers don't mask the disinvestment, and they don't mask the other system responses that protect that investment. And before I go on my high horse on this, the interlocking of our criminal legal system and our economic development approaches just must be raised, especially this week, as we think about the needs that the economic development regime requires, and what has to happen in those neighborhoods for those other places to be considered important investments. So it's existential, I mean, like I have this debate in my firm all the time. I got my firm, we do a lot of traditional economic development planning, and I have these debates. Well, they say, well, what do you, all your nice stuff, who's going to pay for that? Somebody's got to pay for that. There's got to be some value created. And then I say, well, you keep making these approaches the norm to how we approach policy planning, you're going to have to keep paying for these services forever. So when are we going to try something different? So I offer you not much, except wondering what the outcome, Laura, was of your conversation. But I would say that, again, it really depends on asking your question: for whom is this economic development? To what are we building? For whom is this city? And so, I think asking those questions helps us get closer to resolving those debates.
Laura, can you share an outcome, or maybe it was a TBD?
I think there's some tension right now, and it feels like, times start to change. So there's public engagement work that the university does, and there's economic development. And are those two one and the same? Mm-hmm. Well, those words were used distinctly differently for universities, because economic development was more about creation of companies. It was more about creation of wealth and taxes and property development, sponsored research, industry engagement, lots of the activities that many of us do. On the other hand, the community response of what we owe the community, what we should be doing in the community that's public engagement facing, could be from college education to humanities to rural outreach, a variety of other things. But I feel like the two need to intersect in a smarter way and not be pitted kind of one against the other. And part of the economic development definition, if you go to IEDC, one of our peer organizations, would talk about creating a greater quality of life in your city. And that's where I think those intersect in a different way, that you're creating a better place to live, and that needs to be an inclusive, better place to live, which is kind of coming to Andrea's point of to who does it benefit?
Well, I'll just say one more thing, Lauren. I think you're absolutely right that these questions need to be asked holistically, because I'll tell you, some of my, magic clients where the thing doesn't work out so well, they're either academic institutions or philanthropic institutions. They wear many hats, and one of them is landowner, real estate developer, and I think we can sometimes hide that part of their role, because of their academic or philanthropic missions. But the fact is that while you're talking about this public good of education, or, as landowner, as economic developer, there is a question of what impact are you trying to have? So is it possible to ask this question of what are we as an institution in many of the roles that we play, with many of the assets that we bring to this, from land to services to education to, and I often start with clients, what do you have to offer the world? What are your assets? What's your leverage? Let's identify that first. Now, how are you deploying each of those in the direction, if you agree that this is your direction, towards making a more equitable place? And that in that trade, then you can get to the trade-offs that come. But I absolutely agree with you that it is very difficult, when folks play many roles, and sometimes their hats as landowners, as as economic developers, can seem incidental, to their public mission and sense of purpose. So I hear you. I feel you. I wish you luck on this holistic framework.
Next,
and I'll also remind my peers, Leah, that if you're not a faculty member, stay out of promotion and tenure discussions as much as you can.
That's right. That's right. That was the first takeaway. Okay, let's see. Here's another question for you, Andrea, that was sent to me. You talked about that migration from using some of these metrics as leverage to more of a standard operating procedure, right? I mean, more just ingrained to how we go about our business. And so can you talk a little bit about that migration, maybe kind of some of the steps along the way to getting there, because I hear you, right? I hope we're past the time of saying, okay, well, we have to do this affordable housing thing, and that's just the lever. We just got to turn that lever and put it somewhere. Okay, so then we got to move to something different and better. And how do we get there?
Yeah, I mean, that is the question. How do clearly you need a toolkit. No, I'm kidding. I mean, I think the first thing is to name, like, what's the goal here, and and how do you get the institution to agree, that making this a goal, is important to institutional health, viability. Now, if you well, and I'll say this also, I think it's a combination of an inside and outside. Now, from the inside perspective, you're a change agent in your institution. You want the institution to say, our mission here is to be equitable in how we do our work, and to make an equitable place, and to mitigate against any unintended consequences that could further disparity. Okay, now what? What do we need to do to get there? Who needs to do it? And how do we hold ourselves accountable to that? And that's, an approach that means getting really serious about the difference between diversity, equity, and inclusion, that gets really serious about identifying what are the challenges to inequity where I am, and how does what I have, my assets, my leverage, how could I be putting those toward, not how could I just start a new program? Fine. If I started with, how could I do a great program, a STEM program we're going to hear about, and I can't wait for that presentation. If the question was, what are the challenges and disparities in access to STEM in my city? And then you said, how could I bridge those disparities? Well, that's a different question. And that could lead you to a very different scaled solution. So I think it starts from institutional commitments. But I don't want us to be naive here. Community pressure is required. And that's where we talk about power. And there's another question I see here about governance. Mm-hmm. Outside actors need also to be willing to engage and to hold institutions to account, and they need to have the tools to be able to do that. So one of the things I say to my institutions, my clients, tell the community how you actually operate. Tell them more about what you do and who you are. I say that to government clients all the time. I say it to so that they understand how best to hold you accountable, because I truly think this change won't happen unless there's both an inside mission and commitment, but also outside pressure of people who are willing to fight and hold accountable. Sorry, I'm going on too long. Go ahead, Lee.
Okay. So I'm going to hold some of the other questions for a little bit later in our session. And I'm going to turn now to Danya Perry with Wake County Economic Development. I am so proud that I'm living in a community where Danya Perry is doing work. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Danya, for your presentation. Welcome.
Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Leah, thank you again for this opportunity. And let me tell you that I could have listened for the rest of the day to you, Andrea. Truly could have. I think this is an important conversation. And it's a conversation that honestly, it comes through with conversations like this because equity is messy. It's about reimagining, dismantling. It's about doing some real critical conversations that are uncomfortable. But at the same time, recognizing that uncomfortable does not mean unsafe. And when we have those uncomfortable conversations, ultimately what we're saying is, how can we create a better community that truly serves everyone and at the same level? So I'm excited about sharing some of the work that we're doing. I am with the Raleigh Chamber, but I also serve a role as the director, not only of diversity, equity, and inclusivity, but also director of equitable economic development. And so I'm excited to share with you all some of the work that we're doing now. I understand that I have a short amount of time, and so I'm going to put myself on a little bit of a stop clock here. And I promise you, I'll get you out of here by at least 5:30, 5:45. Get you in a good mood and make sure that I don't take too much of your time. I'm sure some of you probably started rolling your eyes. I'm only here for 10 minutes. So let's talk a little bit about the work that we're doing, and it's at the intersection for us of inclusive prosperity and systemic racism. A lot of what Andrea presented to you really speaks to the work that we're doing and sort of the history behind the work. And it sort of really starts from a conversation that when we talk about our region, when we talk about the Triangle, when we talk about Wake and Durham and Orange County, we recognize that we are an incredible magnet. We magnetize top talent. We magnetize companies that are looking to move or expand in our community. We magnetize opportunities. We magnetize accessibility. But the one thing that we are really bad at, and something that we've been ideating about how to change, is that ladder of upward mobility. And so ultimately what we want to do, we recognize that our rungs in this ladder of upward mobility is a little bit further apart than my parents when they were born in the 40s. And so the question becomes, what are those pillars? What are the components? What are the levers? What are the policies or the practices that we have to shift, that we have to reimagine to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to prosper inclusively? In 2018, when this conversation started, my role was actually created late 2018. And but prior to that, the conversation really was, I think, galvanized around the work of Dr. Raj Chetty out of Harvard. And this is sort of a map, one of the pieces that came out of his conversation that really spoke to upward mobility in America, and spoke to how your zip code, as Andrea said, it can be predictive of your success. So ultimately, based upon his research and mining of data, he recognized that some parts of our community, if you are born in the bottom 20%, what is your percentage likelihood to be able to move from the bottom 20 to the top 20%? And some of our communities, we were in the lower teens. I mean, we were 4, 5, even 3% likelihood. Now, if you are in the southeastern part of our country, let's also acknowledge that we hold 51% of the country's poverty just in the southeast alone. So there's a lot of conversations about that as well, especially the demographic breakdown. So this was sort of the underpinning of our conversation. And then when you get granular, looking at what other cities are having to deal with that have also been great magnets, but have truly outpaced their residents. So for us, in the process of coming up with a strategy, it really started with a conversation around identifying our critical measures and assessing those needs. We had to get deep into the data. As much as we want, and we do rely on being quantitative, the second part of it is really qualitative, which is a part of how do we make sure that we are recognizing and understand the community needs. I call it a listening tour, but the listening tour isn't just a tour that ends. It's a tour that's continuous. It's a tour that keeps you mindful about the folks that you need to engage in the process from the beginning, but it also is a big part of understanding the gaps. I harken back to a quote that really struck me when I was younger, back in 1991, the release of a movie called Boys in the Hood with one of the actors, Ice Cube. He actually served as Doughboy at the end of the movie as they were talking about their life struggles within the Compton and the neighborhood that was truly impoverished, and an example of gentrification, an example of gaps of empowerment. He made a powerful statement that really resonated with me. He said, either they don't know, they don't show, or they don't care about what's going on in the hood. And so the don't know part, the not showing or not caring. So we have a community that cares. So I took that one part down. But one thing that we did not know is we just did not know. And so a part of that listening tour was about understanding what we did not know so that we could show up and create a strategy that was all inclusive. And a part of that is also connecting with and recognizing the key partners that have been doing this work, especially our nonprofits that have been filling in the gaps for us and has been our equity tool for years. So our feedback for us, and it's important to recognize, is that there were obviously historic challenges and historic exclusion that we had to reconcile. We had to have conversations of building relationships, especially before we need them, but recognizing that our most marginalized communities typically are being done to, not being done with. And so we're having to reintroduce folks that are in influence and in power, and folks that have decision-making authority, reintroducing the authenticity of this work. Because once again, when you want to engage a community member that has been consistently marginalized, there will be a defensive stance, and that's normal. One other thing that we had to make sure we communicated is that there was, and we recognize there's a social and political will for change that exists. We have to also understand that there are resources that are available to accomplish our goals. That's what we recognize. And there's also an existence of pervasive silos that have to be dismantled in order for us to reimagine something different. So when you hear folks talk about dismantling something, it's not dismantling to then walk away from this shambles. No, it's not. It's about dismantling to reimagine and to build back up or to reassess. And then lastly, mobilization of resources and community is critical. Again, going back to how we engage our community in the process and recognizing that they are cultural additions to the work that we're trying to do. A part of going into the data meant really truly getting down to, for us, it was getting down to the census tract area and truly understanding, using data points to recognize the communities that we wanted to target for growth. So we identified communities based on poverty rate, unemployment, education, vacant housing, and also dependency ratio. That's that under 18, over 16, over 65. And identified the communities in red and orange and yellow are the communities that we want to have some intentionality around the strategies that we want to design. And when we took that data, we created a vision statement, which really looked at how do we increase equity in the distribution of income, wealth building, employment, and entrepreneurial opportunities for vulnerable populations. This is important for us to have that, as Andrea spoke to, that true north for us in relationship to what the county and the region was focusing upon. And then for us to look at what effective practices have been out that have worked in other communities, was able to solicit a third-party research organization to help support our baselining and collecting of metros that look similar to us and practices that they've used. And growing up in a neighborhood, I had to, with two sisters, they always made me play double dutch with them. And I remember one of the hardest things for me as they were turning that rope was trying to figure out, how do I jump in? And it was literally that process of just rocking backwards and forwards, trying to figure out, when do you jump in? Now, we are not an expert in any of this work, but ultimately we see the need. And so we talk about just jumping in, just starting somewhere. But you have to have, as Andrea said, that true north. And so we looked at not only looking at inclusion of our community and outreach processes and policy, and then investing in targeted growth areas. And that's especially with our new developments. How do we incentivize companies to move and to grow and to implant within some of our targeted growth areas? How do we help build up an entrepreneurial ecosystem in our most vulnerable communities? How do we develop the workforce and start looking at upskilling? And then also, how do we incentivize companies for inclusive business practices and really accelerating their own DEI practices and strategies within their companies. All of those are sort of interplays in the work that we're doing. Now, once you look at all that data, for us, we had to disaggregate it. And we saw that the disparities were overrepresented within our Black and Brown brothers and sisters. And so for us, we had to also call it for what it is, and understanding that running parallel with our equitable economic development work was also the work around looking at how do we dismantle systemic racism. And so we created this collaborative and this calling card, if you will, this commitment for a better wake, which was an effort for both private and public entities to work towards dismantling systemic racism, but first understanding and operationalizing truly what it is. And so we created a pledge and a commitment. We're asking companies and community members to sign up to show solidarity in this work, but then also coming to start looking at what are the 4 pillars that we want to attack as a community. And we decided to look at education, health equity, economic mobility, and also criminal justice reform, to look at how can we support and dismantle the disparities that we see within these areas. And so we're working on a strategy now, a blueprint, if you will, in which by September, we're hoping to be able to have a community-facing dashboard that will help provide us another way to quantify and qualify our true north for the work that we're doing. So really excited about that work. More importantly, changing the infrastructure is important, but we also understand the interpersonal dynamics and the interpersonal relationship building and working across difference is just as important. And so we created an anchor website and a campaign that you can go to abetterwake.com and find resources and action guide and toolkits. There go that word. I love toolkits to help enhance your conversations around how do we work across difference as an individual, checking my own personal bias. Do I understand and have compassion for the lived experience of others that are different than mine? And so there's a lot of strategies. We provide books, podcasts, videos, a whole host of information so you can really sink your teeth into really getting into and reaching in to do self-assessment, mindful work, to get to a place where you can then change your infrastructure and or system. So please, if you like to be able to check out a model of what we're doing, go to this website. It's really cool, really interactive. And I say, look, rip off and duplicate, take it. We would love for this to be scaled up in other communities across the country. So with that, I'm going to either solicit you for questions or go to the comments box to see if there's any questions. But Leah, again, I appreciate
Thanks,
the opportunity
Danya.
to share, and hopefully I didn't go over my time.
No, you're good. I hope you all will take advantage of that website that Danya and his folks have created. I've already ripped off a bunch of stuff from that myself. So I hope everybody will share within your communities. All right, so next up, we want to hear about a case study from University of Illinois Research Park, and this program is called Reboot. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Rebecca, and you're going to get us kicked off, you and Lori. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you for having us. So this is Lori Gold Patterson. I will get started here. So in 2019, I'm going to tell you about a program called Illinois Reboot that really started in 2019 when the Chancellor of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign convened an economic development advisory council that pulled together private and public entities who are interested in the economic development of our county. Within a few meetings, the Chancellor's Council identified 4 to 5 significant areas of interest and broke into working groups. As a community business owner, tech business owner, employer, this was really the first committee that I've ever been part of that I feel immediately got down to work and actually has impacted our county. One of the working groups was charged with doing a feasibility study on the possibility of starting a local code academy. So let's go to the next slide. Thank you. A traditional code academy or boot camp teaches the programming skills that employers look for and aims to enable students to immediately apply their new coding skills. We were particularly interested in building a more diverse and inclusive tech workforce. For our research park, this would help to improve tenant company performance and make the economic impact of the research park and its jobs more available to community members, not just people from the university. From a community point of view, my point of view as a local tech employer and community member, the goal was to increase opportunity for women and people of color in our community and to continue to grow our economy and help grow and retain our local employers. So next slide, please. As an important first step in our feasibility study, we pulled together 10 to 12 community and research park employers and asked them a series of questions. We wanted to design this training to meet the specific needs of our local employers. We also took this opportunity to gauge the level of interest and contributions that we could rely upon from our employers. Next slide. This early buy-in, this is a picture of one of those meetings. This early buy-in from employers was essential and really laid the groundwork for what has become a strong partnership between the training and the employers. Interestingly enough, employer engagement in this initiative was actually easy to obtain. Every single company that we asked wanted to participate, and they did so with time investment, offering contact information to become mentors and networking with the participants. And it may have made a difference that the initial committee was made up of public and private. So we really knew how to, as a group, speak to those employers because some of us were those employers. We also pulled together potential students to query them about what would enable them to participate in a code academy. And just based on the exceptional two speakers that we've had so far, there's a lot of background work here in those of us who were involved who have worked for years in diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of technology employment. So we had lots to pull from and individuals to bring in to really understand how to ensure that this would be a program that would engage and retain those individuals that we were looking to have participate. Next slide. From this early, robust feasibility study, we identified the core drivers and strategies for the program. For our program, we determined that utilizing an existing training curriculum rather than developing our own was paramount for the success of the program. We didn't want to put our resources into developing content that likely already existed. We also determined that our employers wanted and needed, above all else, diverse technical talent to recruit. We boiled down the skill needs that matched across most or all of the employers, and that ended up being Python, SQL, data analytics, and a few others. And we got reliable commitments from employers to be mentors, to potentially provide internships, and to offer financial support. Next slide. We then designed what we have today, which is Illinois Reboot, which it's a free technology training program with a primary target audience of underrepresented, diverse candidates, and a goal to help community members enter and stay within the tech workforce in Central Illinois. In the design of the program, we included a few unique requirements. First, we committed to having a majority of women and minorities in each cohort. Second, we assembled a diverse selection committee who would be responsible for selecting each and every student participant and building cohorts that would bond and support each other. Third, we established 2 career coaches, and this is really, to me, the sweet spot of this program. One of those career coaches focused on resume building, and the other focused on participants' career goals, helping them personally network, and supporting them in bringing their authentic, unique self and talents to the cohort. For women and minorities in technical fields, it's often hard to feel like you can be yourself. But companies and organizations are finally beginning to realize that diversity and inclusion are not benevolent acts. They're realizing that having a diverse and inclusive culture is a competitive requirement. Lee, I think at the beginning you were saying that, you know, if we do nothing, we stay at status quo. Actually, that's no longer true. You will, if you're an organization, you will not be competitive and you will not even be at status quo if you don't get this, if you don't bring true diversity and inclusion into your organization. There's now an abundance of data that shows that diverse and inclusive organizational cultures result in measurably higher innovation, growth, and competitiveness. So through our program, it was important to us that we had a component that empowered participants to bring their cultural wealth to the table. And finally, we assembled a list of willing employer mentors and other local tech professionals who agreed to network with participants upon introduction. They responded immediately when there was an introduction made, so that we could increase the likelihood of future employment for class participants. Next slide. So we just successfully completed our second cohort, and we're feeling ourselves a little bit. We're feeling pretty proud and of accomplishing all of our goals. We received far more applications than we anticipated for both cohorts to date. Our participant acceptance rate is just under 17%. The cohorts have had a majority of minority participants and a majority of female participants. And our second cohort, due to COVID, also targeted those whose jobs had been affected by COVID, and 70% of our participants met this criteria. Next slide. So let me give you just a few examples of who we're serving with Illinois Reboot. We have an elementary school teacher who's seeking to enter the ed tech workforce. We have a nurse that I think pulled the heartstrings of all of us. She had COVID and was on a ventilator for 36 days. Months after suffering COVID, she's still unable to stand for any period of time, so she can't return to nursing. She saw the social media ad for Illinois Reboot and saw it as a calling and opportunity to change her career path for the future. We have a veteran who had some technical experience but needed a reboot, and some interesting conversation after the class with him. This is a white male who felt like he found he used the word, "I found my tribe. These are my people. This is where I need to be learning." And I think he was referring to it being a very diverse place where there were no airs, where the culture wasn't strongly that tech bro culture. And we have a microscopy technician from Brazil who, due to COVID, has not been able to get his diploma validated. So he couldn't get employment here. Through the program, he got networked with some of our corporate partners, and now he's employed at our largest hospital and will be furthering his career in med tech. So hope I didn't talk too fast. I know we're all trying to stay within time here. I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca now, and she's going to dive in more to the nuts and bolts of launching and managing the program.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Lori. I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of operational things. One thing that people asked us was, how did you recruit this group of folks? And really a key was that some of us have been embedded in this community for a very long time, and we simply called people and asked them, invited them to apply. But also Facebook, of all things, was kind of crucial in this. So you can see what our cohort looked like from an application standpoint, and we ended up accepting about 30 folks from this. As Lori mentioned, corporate engagement was in fact easy with this. All of those companies you see listed not only said yes, but they invested time for 3 to 4 staff people to come and actually teach a class for the students and engage with them. So that was really critical in the participants' experience. Some of you might be asking, well, what did this cost? How did this work? Well, here you go. We had staff, of course. We had an existing curriculum that we used, and we were fortunate to be granted money from the US EDA. We had a corporate sponsor in American Family Insurance. and the University of Illinois Research Park, of course, was part of the in-kind support. But this $40,000 per cohort is a decent estimate of the cost of what this was for us. And more important than hearing from us, you might want to hear from some of our students. So I'm going to show you a video that we put together after the graduation ceremony last week.
The EDA provided funding in the last year through the CARES Act program to our university center, allowing us to launch the Reboot program.
I'll just say that I'm forever grateful for this program because it opened my eyes to many different codes, many different computer languages that I didn't know even exist.
For me, this was in some ways sort of an exploratory mission, like figuring out, you know, what parts of data science are my jam. And so I figured out that I love SQL. And so I think SQL's my jam.
I thought it was really cool to be part of a diverse group of students from different ages, different backgrounds.
Highlights of my career this year, and really excited to see where this program goes into the future. The students were engaging, the instructors were prepared, and really the directionality where we're headed to be a more inclusive technical society is fantastic.
And I think for sure it came in very intimidating, not having any background in any data analysis or just coding languages. And so I think it's just very reassuring to see how helpful everyone was.
I couldn't be more proud. I couldn't be more proud of you all than I am of the 10, 15, 12,000 undergraduates that we have walk across the stage in the whole life. I'm very proud of all that you've done. I am so impressed, and this makes me very happy.
And with that, if you had questions for us, I wasn't able to monitor the chat, but we could probably get to those later, since I'll toss it back to Leah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca and Lori. Appreciate that. And we'll get to some of those other questions and discussions in just a bit. All right, so batting cleanup is Ray Trapp with Research Triangle Park. We're over to you, Ray.
Thank you, Leah, and good afternoon, everyone. It is indeed a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Leah, I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to fight.
Don't you worry about it. We're going to make it up.
I'm going to fight my inner elected official, reformed elected official, and keep this within a time limit. So my pleasure today to come to you all and talk about diversity initiatives in RTP. And I love the way that we frame this as the case for change. And so not only is this a case for change, but it's also a case for reevaluation. And I think that anytime that we're doing anything and we have any program, there comes a point when you need to reevaluate that and see how intentional that program is and what's the true return on investment for that program and for the participants of that program. I'll start out talking about the RTP DEI Collective. And Andrea, I want to thank you for starting out and saying to unpack DEI, because I think we get into a space where it's easy to say DEI, and like with anything else, we understand that term and we know how intentional it is and how impactful it is, but some folks don't. And so I do think that it should be a practice for us as practitioners and pushing for diversity, equity, and inclusion to continue to unpack that and continue to make that case. And while making that case, not get caught up in saying DEI. So our diversity, equity, and inclusive collective is right here in the Research Triangle Park. And we started this probably about 18 months ago now. The conversation started on how we could make the most impact out of the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that were being, each different corporation was embarking upon. If you look up DEI personnel and DEI executives were popping up at every corporation really across the park and across the nation. So about 18 months ago, we set out to figure out what that would look like. And on top of that, to join forces and collaborate better to further the mission of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So with that, why? Why the time? Now was the time to amplify. If we have everyone doing everything in silos, it's like we know with anything, when you're doing something in a silo, the only effect that you get is that singular effect from that one company or one corporation that's pushing their initiatives. But there are over 300 corporations in the park. So to band together and to amplify that message is something that truly would benefit not only our efforts in DEI, but band us together more as a community, which again, when stressing diversity, equity, and inclusion, the thing that you're building is community, an inclusive community. So that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to amplify that and connection. We are no different than any other innovation park across this country. The corporations within the park sometimes are all about the corporation and staying within that corporation. Our campuses, especially the campus here at RTP, was built for R&D, for research and design. So even how we're designed and how our layout is designed does not promote participation. It does not promote collaboration. So we had to do that. And this was a way for us to connect. Also to integrate DEI behaviors across our corporation and spread that across the region. It allowed us to also scale small initiatives and band together to increase that scale to make them larger initiatives, and establishing a network for professionals. A lot of instances, and people will not come out and say this, but a lot of people that have been placed into these diversity, equity, and inclusion roles have no idea what they're doing in these roles. So I'm going to be very honest and say that. There's a lot of times this has been seen as, we have a senior Black executive, let's promote you to this position, and now you're in charge of diversity, equity, and inclusion for our corporation. We can't do that. So we have to get together as a group, and for folks that are in these positions, allow them to be successful. So that means having workshops and bringing information to the table that they can in turn use and take that back to their corporations. So these were all the reasons why this was the time for us to create a diversity, equity, and inclusion collaborative. Now, again, to why this was the time and the opportunity was there. Last spring, as we see with the culmination of the trial of Officer Chauvin, that started conversations that should have been ongoing and did not take that incident for that, should not have taken that incident to start the conversations. But those conversations and that incident sparked this narrative and this discussion and this breakdown of previous walls of corporations to think, are we doing everything that we need to do? So that discussion was the why now, and that continues to be the why now. But as pointed out earlier, this diversity is not something that's a payment. This is actually a plus. This is a positive. When corporations look at diversity and when site selectors look at diversity and look at the diversity of a region, that's a plus. Your corporation, your park being diverse is a plus. So those are the things that we have to break down these silos and continue to push this message of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is what the DEI Collective for the Research Triangle Park seeks to do. Now, STEM RTP, and this is our case for change and also our case for reevaluation. STEM RTP was an amazing program that lasted 5 years. STEM RTP was the typical program that we at research parks and we in higher education and we in corporations think about as this is a way to involve underserved youth in STEM and to promote STEM in underserved youth. Great day. Bring underserved kids out to the park. As you can see, they get to spend time with the corporations. They do some cool experiments with STEM, get to see new and innovative things, and that lasts for a day. So we get great pictures out of it, great photo op, as you see here, great t-shirts. Corporations feel great about themselves. The park feels great about itself. Everyone feels great about themselves, but there's no follow-up. There's no intentionality to it. The numbers across the park, the numbers across the tech and the STEM fields stay just as low, and minorities are just as underrepresented anytime that we have programs like this. When we talk about intentionality, I love the old saying that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So that's what we have to think about. That's what we have to realize and analyze and think about what we're doing and the effect that it truly has on the people that we're attempting to affect and what we're attempting to do. So STEM RTP, we had to sit down and evaluate the program. As you see, spring of 2020, that was COVID. So with COVID, you could no longer bring children to the research park. Couldn't happen. COVID restrictions wouldn't allow it. So that also allowed us internally to evaluate the program and to figure out how we can make a more intentional, more effective program that went on year round. So for us, that started with looking and finding organizations that were already in this work. Organizations, small nonprofits that were already on the ground doing this intentional work of promoting STEM every day. So we identified small organizations, those with budgets under $5 million, where STEM would make a significant impact. We partnered with Fidelity Charitable, which is a corporation in the park, and they provided their services pro bono. We went after corporations that were committed, that had expert board members and staff that represented their corporations in this diverse community throughout the state of North Carolina. We wanted to see collaborative efforts that not only focused on our region, but a huge mission of the Research Triangle Foundation is to have an economic impact on the citizens throughout the state of North Carolina. So those were all things that we look to do. We have a distinction in the Research Triangle Park that we are a service district, which means that our corporations tax themselves. Our corporations believe so much in this diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative that those funds are allotted from that service district tax to this program. That is how much they believe into this. So we started a grant making program, finding those programs, finding those things where we could leverage the dollars that we would normally spend on an amazing field trip, an amazing day, but focus that on the folks that are on the ground doing this work every single day. 2021 recipients, as you can see, these are the 4 organizations that we have selected that are doing this intentional work every day. We'll start with Code the Dream. They provide free intensive training and software development to help people launch tech careers. Underserved students, they are doing this every single day, not one day, not 2 days, but 365 days out of the year. And virtually, they're even doing more now because they can produce their content through virtual systems. That money and that funding that we give them will go to capacity building support, high growth demand, and they're also starting a rural tech initiative, which we've seen through COVID. That digital divide between urban and rural has never been so real as what we see now during COVID. Next up, the Cramden Institute. I'll say that correctly because they do amazing work. They refurbish computers, laptops, and devices, but mostly laptops and computers to give to students and families, and also teach computer skills in classes with technical support and out of school STEM learning. So again, addressing that need and that critical digital divide across the state of North Carolina. So this funding that we will give to Cramden, that's going to be capacity building, and it's also going to help them move into a second building to provide larger services and increase class sizes, which they're doing free to underserved students. Women NC, this amazing organization provides mentors from RTI. So RTI is the Research Triangle Institute, and we like to say we're the dirt, we're the land, and RTI is the brains of the Research Triangle Park. but they provide mentors that work with women across the state of North Carolina in STEM-related fields. They present these policy recommendations to local elected officials and also to other corporations throughout the state in STEM-related areas to further assist with that. The funding that we provide will also be for capacity building and will help them hire staff people for communications and outreach and to expand their program into more regions within the state of North Carolina. And the final one, the pitch competition. And this is a collaboration between the Duke Fuqua School of Entrepreneurship and North Carolina Central University's College of Business, was a pitch competition for Black student founders and Black student owners with a tech focus. And these amazing entrepreneurs pitched their corporations to everyone. We were so impressed that we not only did a local award for the local area entrepreneurs that did not make the finals or did not receive funding from the pitch competition, but we gave them a local award. And on top of that, we're doing what we call after the pitch, where we'll have a cohort of local entrepreneurs, Black entrepreneurs, that through a year-long program will receive resources to continue to build out their businesses, to go back into the pitch and hopefully make it successfully through and win funding through that competition. That is our case for looking and reevaluating and the case for change. But not only do we want to highlight those, but we also want to highlight the corporations that are a part of this. We have BASF, Biogen, Lenovo, Luminous Strategies, NetApp, millions across the board, and regional allies, which Danya so graciously on this call, Raleigh Chamber, and Danya attends all of our events. So thank you, Danya, for everything that you do. Finally, I would love to show what diversity looks like. For us, this is Boxyard, which is coming online. Boxyard is an amazing, amazing amenity and add-on for the Research Triangle Park. These are the entrepreneurs that will occupy this space, which is upcycled former shipping containers. This will be retail and restaurants for our area and for our park. This is what diversity looks like. So not only are we making the case for change, but we're also making sure that entrepreneurs get a chance to advance themselves. On to MWBE participation, and for us as a foundation, we want to make sure that we are reflecting that diversity, equity, and inclusion work as a foundation. So we adopted Durham County's disparity study of a 25% goal, and I'm happy to report that as of now, we are meeting that and exceeding that by 7.57%. We are at 32.57% participation for MWBE. So all of those things to say, we are not only talking the talk, but walking the walk, and hope that you will join us in doing so.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate it. I want to spend a little bit of time. We're running behind, of course, and that's just the way it's going to be. I want to spend a little bit of time getting to a couple of questions with our panelists, and then what we are going to go into breakout session, but we're just not going to do our report out with breakouts. So I first want to ask a question of you, Danya, actually that was asked by Andrea. But I'm also curious, well, I think a lot of our attendees are curious about this. How did you get the city and county to have such open conversations about the importance of equity?
Well, so I'm not going to take any of the credit. I think we had, there were stages where our community really started to rally upon the notion. It started with a question that our CEO of the Raleigh Chamber, who is the first female chamber in its 130-year history, asked the question about our development in our community and equity of our development, seeing a lot of, she's a economic developer by trade, so she saw a lot of development in the West, but not the East. And so asking that question and being mindful then created a snowball of asking other questions and got to the place where We have some amazing commissioners that have been championing equity for the longest. We may have not called it equity, but it was about how do we remove barriers or build bridges towards, this whole construct of the rising tide will raise all boats, but recognizing that all boats weren't seaworthy. So how do we create a system that can help support building better boats for community members that are most marginalized? So the position was created, and then my role was to then operationalize it and to broaden it out a little bit more than just about economic development.
Thanks, Tanya. Appreciate that. And here's a question that I want to serve up to you, Andrea, that comes from Jonathan Bates. From a government standpoint, board makeup is critical. How do you suggest we think about equity in the makeup of our boards as far as adjacent community engagement and representation? Or is this better approached from a working committee of the board, et cetera? What do you say, Andrea?
It's a great question, and I had spotted it in the chat before. I mean, there's a couple ways to look at it. So one thing on governance is to say, okay, where could there be inequity in governance? So we might say, and this is so silly, right? But when are we having our meetings? What's required to meet? So where does who I am impact whether or not I could participate at all, or how I would participate in the governance of this session? Does everybody have access to the same information? Because I know you want to go right to the composition, but I think you can't get to the composition until you look at how does who I am determine how I might be able to engage at all? Because then what we wind up doing, if we don't address those barriers, is that then we find the diversity check, often by gender or race, but we don't go more deeply into having new voices or sharing power, because we wind up with the folks who have the privilege to be able to participate on a body like that anyway. If you follow, I think we don't go to the next layer deeper of what it might mean for governance to be a vehicle for meaningful relationship with community. To do that, we've got to examine equity in governance. I don't know, Leah, if I should. Yeah, we can move on to the next question. I see it in your.
No,
I see it in your.
Yeah,
eyes.
No. I'm concentrate on it. So no, that was one of the quick. Can I mention one thing about that to you, Jonathan, and maybe to everybody? There's a board that I serve on in our area for an organization called Tammy Lynn Center, and it serves people with severe developmental disabilities in our area. And one of the things that we noticed as a board, we didn't have a very diverse board at all, but more so than that, we noticed that that the staff who are serving those residents on a daily basis, they're the day-to-day care staff. Many of them are Black and brown. The administrative leadership of Tammy Lynn Center, white, and there wasn't enough interplay. There wasn't enough ability for all employees to voice opportunities for improvement, concerns, and that sort of thing. So that's one of the places that we started as a board, merging those different groups into more of a one cohesive group. And then, once those employees have a better representation in some of the decisions of Tammy Lynn Center, we expanded that to who do you think would also be good representatives on our board of directors? And so I'm just offering that as one way that we are tackling that with that particular board that I happen to serve on. Okay, what we're going to do now, everybody, we are going to move to our breakout groups. And I want you to discuss those few questions that we served up, and those will be broadcast to you in those breakout sessions. What challenge to diversity, equity, or inclusion are you struggling with right now, or question do you have? Why is it a challenge? What is your desired outcome, and where are you stuck? And then we will come back at the end. We'll discuss a few things, but we just won't have time for the readout of those groups. So y'all go have fun and some discussion, and we'll see you in a bit.
Welcome back, everybody.
I dropped in to listen to the conversation in the Phillies group. They were killing it. I loved that conversation. So thank you all for spending some time doing the good work of engaging in the conversation that we served up to you. So I want to thank everybody for participating today. Above that, I want to thank the presenters that participated in this session today, the time that they devoted to us, but also, just the investment in their intellectual property, because I've already gotten a lot of really good feedback, and we haven't even ended the session yet. So, so thank you. Thank you to all of our presenters today. All right, so a reminder, next week is our final week, Module 4. We are going to be talking about accelerated entrepreneurial ecosystems. And this session is going to be led by, you guessed it, Laura from University of Illinois Research Park. So you know you're in good hands already. I want to remind you to give your feedback on this session from today. The feedback that you get helps us make each session just that much better. Also, in case it's not already on your calendar, I want to let you know that we are hosting our international conference in Utah, Innovation Elevated. This will be in person, and it'll be held October 18th through 21st. Hosted, of course, by Jonathan Bates of the University of Utah Research Park. And in case you're not aware, that is actually going to be the celebration of the 35th anniversary of AURP. So we're getting older. All right. In conjunction with that, we are doing our annual awards for excellence and innovation. Those will be presented at the conference in Salt Lake. So I want to challenge you to think about those individuals and projects that you would like to nominate. We're talking about Outstanding Research Park or Innovation District, Emerging Research Park or Innovation District. We're talking about an innovation challenge. You can nominate companies within your research campus, leadership, and then we also have, of course, the new column or the new category over the last couple of years, Rising Star, and this recognizes someone under 40. So at this time, we're going to adjourn, and I want to thank everybody for participating. We are going to see you next Thursday afternoon, or well, morning, depending on what your time zone is. So we'll look forward to seeing you next Thursday. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you.